still sinking in, the horror of what we all saw today.
Many of the residents we spoke to today said that they were watching the television news reports out of Washington, D.C. and New York City when suddenly and very loudly and very violently this national story came right into their own backyards.
The next thing I saw was a big fireball and smoke.
We're all affected. We're all changed forever because of what happened today.
It's important to learn about what these people did that day and how they changed history.
Only because of their choices and their heroic actions was our nation spared from further tragedy.
I've always thought this is an extraordinary moment of American heroism.
But the group of people on that plane, it was as if they all were meant to be there and were able to accomplish what they did.
Never to be forgotten. The heroics of the people on that plane.
It really changed history in just a few moments.
It's been 20 years since the day everything changed.
Right now on Chronicle Remembering 9/11, we're taking a look back at the devastating attacks on America on September 11th, 2001. Michelle and I were here reporting in Somerset County the day of the attacks, reporting about the heroism on board Flight 93.
But we're not just looking back, we're also looking forward as the memories of those heroes on board that day live on, reminding us all to never forget the day that changed history.
There is one report, as of yet unconfirmed, that a plane has hit the World Trade Center, and you can see that there is smoke there coming out of at least two sides of the building.
The first plane hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m., but the terror did not stop then.
It appears that there is more and more fire and smoke enveloping the very top of the building, and as fire crews are descending on this area, it does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
That second hijacked plane hitting the South Tower would be followed by a hijacked airplane crashing into the Pentagon.
The FBI has sealed the scene off, declared it a crime scene.
And a fourth, United Flight 93, crashing into a field here in Somerset County. We all watched in horror as these moments unfolded, followed by the unbelievable devastation as the North and South Towers of the World Trade Center collapsed.
When at 9:59, the South Tower collapsed. It was the second building hit and the first to collapse. We grabbed each other. We hugged each other. We needed another human being in that moment.
The devastating attacks killed nearly 3,000 people and left thousands more injured.
For those of us who were alive on that terrible morning and saw those events unfold, all of us know exactly where we were. We have that image, those images in our heads forever, in our minds and our memories.
Chronicle traveled to New York City to visit the National September 11th Memorial and Museum to learn why this moment, 20 years after the 9/11 attacks, is so important.
You have young people who were little, very little, toddlers, infants, when 9/11 happened. They have no memory. So this milestone anniversary is actually a moment of transition as we move from memory to history.
They're supporting a Never Forget fund to provide resources to teach what we've learned from the 9/11 attacks. Amy Hargrave knows she'll never forget. She lost her father, TJ, in the attacks on the World Trade Center.
My father was 38 years old, worked in the North Tower of the World Trade Center, and was a vice president at Cantor Fitzgerald.
She was only 4 years old when he was killed. The one thing she remembers most about her dad, his hugs.
He had the biggest hugs, the biggest bear hugs, and hugs in the point that when you hugged him, it wasn't just because you were a kid. He would just give you the biggest bear hug, and one of the biggest things that we all talk about him is he was always the last to let go.
Wendell August Forge in Pittsburgh has a role in the effort to never forget. They're handcrafting commemorative tickets for the fund.
There's times where you look back in your career and you can picture certain events and certain projects that'll stand out forever, and this is one of them.
Such an honor to
be a part of this.
Like so many in Pittsburgh and across the country, Wendell August Forge president Christian Werner knows how important it is to keep the history of September 11th alive and teach the next generation how that day changed the world.
I feel if people know that there's people attacking our democracy every day, this fund will help people to recognize as well as to look back for literally generations to come to understand how important it is to protect our Constitution, to protect our rights, but to most all to protect our civil liberties.
Or for family members like Amy Hargrave, how it changed her life forever with what she lost.
He wasn't there for graduations, wasn't there for my proms and just different events like that, and gymnastics competitions.
But she says the memorial in New York will help keep her father's memory alive for many years to come.
I'm such a believer that someone dies twice. Someone dies when they physically leave their body and then when the last person says their name. So by these visitors coming to see his name and saying his name or touching it on the site, he's still being remembered and his name is still being spoken out there.
Plane down. That was the message sent out to first responders in Somerset County when Flight 93 crashed. Paul Van Osdal spoke to some of the first to arrive here at the scene.
The morning of September 11th, Shanksville volunteer firefighter Keith Kuster was getting dressed for his grandmother's funeral when he heard something explode about a mile from his home.
We actually felt it, and then we heard this explosion. I've never been into an earthquake, but I would say that's what an earthquake would feel like, because it shook the house that I lived in.
At Diener's funeral home in nearby Stoystown, which was handling services for Kuster's grandmother,
things going on here.
Employee and former Assistant Fire Chief David Fox was watching television coverage of the attack on the World Trade Center.
I said, well, one thing we don't have to worry about is the plane coming down here, and then it was only probably 2 minutes till the tones went off for Stoystown, Shanksville, and Freedens for this aircraft.
Kuster and Fox both missed the funeral so they could respond to the crash. They were among the first to arrive. Both were struck by what they did not see.
When I got there, I thought, well, this isn't a big plane. It can't be a big plane that crashed because there was very little debris.
Where did the plane go? We were looking for the plane.
Investigators later determined Flight 93 crashed into an abandoned strip mine which swallowed up much of the aircraft. As they began walking the site, first responders saw evidence of the crash's devastating impact.
There was some things that you saw that you wouldn't really want to see again. I mean, you knew that there was no survivors. Let's just say that.
It was a smoky odor that I can't describe, but I'll never forget.
Jill Miller was one of the first paramedics at the crash site.
It was very disturbing. My job was then and continues to be helping people. And I came here to help people, and there were no people to help, unfortunately. So that in and of itself is a bit emotional.
When the rescue turned into a recovery mission, first responders spent weeks helping police and the FBI comb the crash site for debris and human remains.
You were going down through the woods, you were marking parts, you were marking plane parts, personal items, anything, that was related to that crash. You had a certain flag that you had to put next to it.
Our focus quickly became taking care of the people who were here for recovery, doing everything we could for the family members that were coming in, just being here, being available.
Kuster remembers people visiting the Shanksville firehouse constantly, many of them family members of victims.
You would get to know those people that were on the flight through their family members.
What was that like?
That was emotional. The plane crashed in your backyard and they're part of your town now.
Kuster left the department 5 years after the crash, but memories of that day still haunt him.
Sometimes I'll wake up at night and I'll feel that I'll have dreams that planes are crashing and I can't get away from them. The parts are coming through the woods or the parts are, it hits the ground.
Memories from 20 years ago are also fresh for Miller. In the weeks after 9/11, she attended celebrity fundraisers to support victims' families. She still has thank you cards from school children from around the country. She spent years helping plan the Flight 93 memorial. What's it like for you to come back out to this site?
It's tough. It's hard and very emotional every time. even after 20 years.
The site where Fox used to hunt rabbits as a kid now means something much more.
After the plane crash, then it became a different feeling when you're there. It wasn't just the wooded area you went hunting in, it was more of a sacred ground,
They were the first heroes in the war on terror on U.S. soil, and they won their battle in the skies above southwestern Pennsylvania.
40 strangers came together on Flight 93 to successfully prevent the terrorist from reaching their target. A few of them were able to use the airphones on board the plane to call home. And that's when they learned about the crash into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. And then they were brave enough to take action. Lauren Grancolis was one of those brave passengers. She had an adventurous spirit, as you can see here in this home movie of her skydiving. On September 11th, Lauren was 3 months pregnant. She and her husband Jack had been trying for a long time to become parents. Lauren had just told her family in New Jersey that she was going to be a mom and was heading back to join Jack in California. She got to the Newark airport early and switched to an earlier flight. Jack woke up and saw the news of the attacks in New York, and then he saw the answering machine's blinking light and pressed play just as he watched the video coming in from the crash in Shanksville.
She said, "I just want you to know I love you more than anything, and please tell my family I love them too. Goodbye, honey." And at that time, I had the TV on downstairs and saw the hole in Shanksville and the report that it was a United 93 out of Newark. And that's when it hit me, and it literally hit me because I fell to the ground.
I remember the day like it was yesterday. You know what I mean? You can just visualize it in your head. I was working that day, and I can remember going to work early in the morning, and the thing that stood out most to me was how blue the sky was that day.
That vivid blue sky would soon be clouded with tragedy. While at work, Ken Nackey got a call from his wife that his brother, Joey, was on Flight 93. He's not surprised his big brother took on those terrorists. After all, Joey had a Superman tattoo.
I've seen him grow up, and I saw the man that he was. And honestly, he was afraid of no man. You know what I mean? But I think his drive that day would just be to get home to have dinner with his family. Nothing more, nothing less.
Gordon Felt was desperately trying to reach his brother, Ed.
I called his cell phone and said, "Ed, when you land, call us. We're concerned."
Moments later, he watched television in horror at what happened on his brother's plane.
They had to somehow gather their thoughts, gather their courage. We know that they talked about a response, a plan to take back control of the plane. We know they voted on that plan. I mean, what a wonderful tribute to our democracy. We know they prayed. And then we know that they acted.
I'd give anything to have Joey back in this world, because the world is not a better place without him and the 39 other passengers and crew member aboard Flight 93. But I think the world is now a little bit safer based on their actions.
I mean, certainly, how could you not feel pride in knowing that this first battle in this current war on terrorism was won by 40 individuals that barely knew each other that morning. They were able to rise to the occasion in a moment's notice, the Minutemen of the 21st century, and women of the 21st century. They fought. And while they lost their lives, they won the battle.
They gave their lives so we can live our lives like it's September 10th.
Next on Chronicle.
We knew that there were thousands of people that were just killed right in front of our eyes, and there was nothing we could do about it.
Local firefighters answering the call.
We collectively made the decision. We wanted to go do something.
How they stepped up to help in New York City after the 9/11 attacks. So many first responders in western Pennsylvania rushed here when Flight 93 crashed. But others were watching what was happening in New York City, and they immediately felt called to go there and help in the recovery efforts.
For McKeesport firefighters Chris Searcy and Jimmy Young, they were answering a call to destiny.
Enormous pieces of debris just falling one right after the other.
I can't believe it's been 20 years. It's hard to believe it's been 20 years.
The words don't come easily.
And I'll start tearing up because it's just, you know, I haven't talked about this in a long time, but.
Firefighters Chris Searcy and Jimmy Young.
I don't like to think of what we did as heroic.
The two men were on duty at their McKeesport firehouse on 9/11 and could not believe what they were seeing on TV.
When we watched the first tower fall, the South Tower, we knew that there were thousands of people that were just killed right in front of our eyes.
Right then, they decided to drive to Ground Zero.
Not going wasn't an option.
Young and Searcy arrived at Engine 24, Ladder 5, Battalion 2, the Greenwich Village firehouse that lost 11 brothers when the towers collapsed.
The mission that day when we pulled up is we were told we're going down to find them. And that's what the objective was that day, was to try to find the remains.
The men walked to nearby St. Anthony's Church to borrow tables and chairs, preparing for the families of the firefighters who perished. The priest who answered the door to help, Father Kieran Monahan, the same man who handed Jimmy Young his diploma at Sarah Catholic High School in 1985.
I'm getting chills thinking about it. That's like, it was crazy. And that was just, right then and there, I'm a believer. Right then and there, we were right where we were supposed to be.
Searcy and Young would make 6 trips in all, back and forth over the next several months, helping with the painstaking, heartbreaking work.
Through that time, I found it important to share the stories of the greatest rescue in our nation's history when they started evacuating those buildings.
Jimmy and Chris giving school presentations back in Pittsburgh over the years, telling the stories of the heroes they served in New York.
The bond we have is just something that you can't really explain it unless you experience it.
While neither man regrets their service, Jimmy Young has paid a steep price.
I never in a million years thought I would get cancer.
2.5 years ago, he was diagnosed with metastatic squamous cell carcinoma. Doctors tell him it was related to his work in Lower Manhattan in September of 2001. Enduring multiple operations, including a grueling radical neck surgery, Jimmy tells me he's grateful he and Chris are covered by the World Trade Center Medical Monitoring Program.
John Stewart became my voice and the voice of so many other responders that are now sick, not only from cancer, but from mental illness and just the different diseases along the way.
Still receiving several therapies 5 days a week, Jimmy is also helping other first responders get help as the state director for the Firefighter Cancer Support Network. Blessings, he says, from his time in New York.
I had no regrets of going to New York. I mean, Chris and I talked about this over the years, that would you have done anything different? And he absolutely 100% we wouldn't.
20 years later, Jimmy and Chris are still in awe of the sacrifice made by their FDNY brethren.
Those firefighters, men, women, all ages, all shapes and sizes, all nationalities, all colors. They worked as one to save lives.
When you sign your name and say, I'm willing to pick up a rifle and serve my country, I'm willing to lay my life down in an effort to correct a wrong that was made to our country. Man, I take my hat off to those guys, man.
Next on Chronicle.
When the plane hit the Pentagon, the reverberation from it was so strong that we felt the windows shake.
The local lawmakers in D.C. at the moment everything changed.
When we heard that there was an attack on the Pentagon, I was like, well, maybe it's the Capitol next.
Their memories of that fateful day and how it changed them forever.
Throughout this hour, Chronicle is hearing reflections on 9/11. Hall of Fame Steelers coach Bill Cowher remembers the aftermath of the attacks, including what he calls an unforgettable moment when he took the team to Somerset County to attend a memorial for the passengers and crew of Flight 93.
Never to be forgotten. The heroics of the people on that plane, and maybe some of the family members that were there, that came to that memorial, and talking with them and thanking them.
More memories and the lessons learned from September 11th ahead as Chronicle Remembering 9/11 continues.
On September 11, 2001, terrorists struck the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C.
And then the fourth plane, Flight 93, crashed here in Somerset County. But it's believed that the target of the terrorists was actually our nation's capital. I sat down with two lawmakers that were there in Washington, D.C. on 9/11, and they take me minute by minute through their experience on that unforgettable day. It was a beautiful morning on Capitol Hill, and Congress was in full session.
This is something I'll never forget. I was actually in the Capitol having breakfast with a colleague.
Yeah, I remember it very clearly. I was preparing for a budget committee meeting. I was in the House of Representatives.
Senator Pat Toomey, a congressman at the time,
before the end of the year,
and Congressman Mike Doyle first heard about American Airlines Flight 11 crashing into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. They thought it was just a tragic accident. But then they were struck with horror as they saw a second plane, United Airlines Flight 175, crash into the South Tower.
At this point, it's like, you know, what's going on here? What, you know, who's behind this attack? You know, are we at war?
Senator Toomey and Congressman Doyle evacuated their staff away from the Capitol building, and they weren't sure what was happening. Then American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the west side of the Pentagon.
I'll never forget when the plane hit the Pentagon, the reverberation from it was so strong that we felt the windows shake where we were. And I thought a bomb went off right on Capitol Hill somewhere because it sounded so close to us, even though the Pentagon is quite some distance away from Capitol Hill. And I just remember thinking, who would do this to us? Like, what country would have the guts to attack us like this? Because we weren't sure what was going on. We didn't know who was responsible.
Did you think it was war?
Yeah, I did.
Then word came that a plane was heading for the Capitol.
Around about this time, the authorities had declared an evacuation order for all of the Capitol complex, and so we all left.
And what were you thinking?
Trying to figure out what is going on here. How big is this attack?
And were you worried that the Capitol was also going to be a target?
I didn't have any idea what to think. When we heard that there was an attack on the Pentagon, I was like, well, yeah, who knows? Maybe it's the Capitol next.
Flight 93 was just 20 minutes away from D.C. and headed straight for the symbol of democracy.
And these brave souls on that plane just decided that wasn't going to happen. And they put a plan together, and they rushed that plane, and they gave their lives to make sure that didn't happen. And they all perished, in Pennsylvania. But they made sure the Capitol was preserved.
And that saved a lot of lives at the Capitol, including perhaps yours.
Absolutely.
They knew that day would change America forever, and that day also changed them.
I don't think there's been a more significant event in American history since I've been in public life than that attack. I think that changed America. It put into motion a series of events. Some good, some terrible. I mean, it changed the country permanently. So it was certainly the biggest single event of my, certainly public life.
And I'll never forget, right after session, we all went down onto the Capitol steps, House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, and we held hands and we sang God Bless America. And it was very emotional. I mean, you could see members crying. I'll never forget that. And there was just a sense that there were no more party registrations at that point, that we weren't from a political party, we were from a country. And we were going to stick together, and we were going to get through this, and we were going to hold the people that did this accountable.
Next on Chronicle.
It's changed the whole world and the way we live.
Teaching the history of 9/11 and the heroes of Flight 93.
Your heroes are these everyday guys that are willing to risk their life to help others.
How a local teacher is making sure future generations never forget the day that changed everything. Among the memories here in Somerset County, artwork outside the only school building in Stony Creek Township.
A totem pole delivered to Somerset County by a Native American tribe from Washington State, carrying the messages of protection and safety. A sculpture of helping hands representing all of the helping hands who aided families, first responders, and investigators.
These are reminders of the importance of teaching the history of 9/11.
And inside that school building, the lessons go on. It may have been 20 years ago, but J.P. O'Connor remembers every detail.
It was a beautiful morning.
It started out as a splendid September Tuesday at the Shanksville Stony Creek School building.
I mean, the sky was clear blue. It was nice temperature. It was a perfect day.
The longtime social studies teacher was free during first period, and here in his classroom watched CNN's early coverage of the two planes crashing into the Twin Towers in New York City. But by 9:30, he says he was back in front of his students, teaching them.
And it only went like 20, 25 minutes, and kaboom!
O'Connor and his fourth graders all felt the entire school building shake.
This end of the building actually shook, and all my ceiling tiles went up and came down. I walked out to the doors, and her and I were looking at this big black puff of smoke that looked like it was coming right below our playground. I just thank God that we were lucky. That I think somebody was looking out for us.
The crash site just a mile and a half as the crow flies, O'Connor says. He is forever grateful for the lives that were spared.
I mean, that plane going at 560-some miles an hour, they were only estimating, and it was in a path line towards the school here. It had only been a second or so later it could have hit the school.
I think it's him.
20 years later, O'Connor is driven each day to keep teaching the volumes of lessons of 9/11, baked into the curriculum here.
All these personal stories are like, it brings it home.
I came from out at Toledo, Ohio, I believe.
He reads portions of Lisa Beamer's book, her husband Todd, one of the leaders who emerged with the plan to stop the hijackers. He lines his hallways with photos and bios of every soul lost on board Flight 93.
I want them to hear the personal side of stories as much as I can. That's why I had them do the passenger search out there to figure out, who these people really were.
Who these people were, he says, were just ordinary human beings, just like them. He remembers when Debbie Borza came to his classroom, quietly telling the students she immediately went to church after learning the news that her daughter, Diora Bodley, lost her life in the crash of Flight 93.
I'd like to teach the personal side of everything as much as I can. I don't care if I teach a war or this and that. I want them to know the stories of the people that lived at that time, and I want primary sources, and I want them to know the feelings of people. I don't want them just to know statistics.
Teaching empathy and compassion. And even though O'Connor knows he'll retire in a few years, these mementos will be part of the history lessons here.
9/11 needs to be taught throughout the country, and the reason why is because it changed the world forever.
And he's confident future generations, so close to sacred ground, will always remember what happened in that field.
And I know these kids will. I mean, they're really interested in knowing the story. They really are.
Next on Chronicle, a common field becomes a field of honor.
Almost everything has symbolism, and whether you realize it or not.
Heroes memorialized in Pittsburgh's backyard.
Those people were so amazing, so courageous.
A look at recent changes at the Flight 93 National Memorial and the tributes there that will live on for years to come.
This is the National Memorial in Somerset County, where the memories of the 40 brave passengers and crew members are kept alive.
But this memorial is evolving. Marcy Cipriani takes a look at some of the changes.
There's so much to see and take in here at the memorial, and it brings back, that day, September 11th.
20 years earlier on that day in 2001, just beyond what is now the Wall of Names, 40 passengers and crew lost their lives. In the 2 decades since Flight 93 was taken down in this abandoned strip mine, this memorial has grown around it.
At 9:28.
Now this is the place where their story is told.
I love you and I hope I can talk to you soon.
Some in their own voices through phone calls home from Flight 93. And through the Tower of Voices, a 93 feet tall musical instrument with 40 wind chimes representing each innocent person on board.
Almost everything has symbolism.
Katie Hostetler is the National Park Service spokesperson for the Flight 93 Memorial.
There's just these tiny notations, diagonal lines in the sidewalk, which are symbolic of the hemlock trees, that when Flight 93 crashed, several thousand gallons of jet fuel poured into the tree line and caught it on fire. And the first thing that first responders see when they come to the site are these charred outlines of the hemlock groves. 45 minutes after the crash of Flight 93, a state police officer finds an ATM bank card just laying amongst the trunks of the hemlock trees. And that ATM bank card purchased the tickets for the hijackers to board the plane that day.
And this marble wall with 40 separate tablets listing each passenger and crew member is directly in line with Flight 93's flight path. And the boulder just beyond the wall has a purpose too.
And out of the requests of the families, the boulder is placed there at the edge of the tree line to mark the approximate impact site.
This is the final resting place of the passengers and crew. Only their families can gather here.
Those people were so amazing, so courageous. You know, it just, you just have to
wonder what they were thinking.
Leroy and Dorothy Leach chose to spend their 59th wedding anniversary here.
And it's beautiful and peaceful here. It's a wonderful day.
The Leaches have traveled to this memorial 3 times. Leroy is 81 years old.
Been a good life.
So they come to honor those who lost theirs here 20 years ago.
Cece Ross Lyles, she is a flight attendant aboard Flight 93, but she's new to the job. She's only been a flight attendant for 9 months.
Life stories Hostetler can hear each time she sees their faces.
Lauren Catuzzi Graham Collis, she was traveling for a funeral here on the East Coast. Jane Folger and Patricia Cushing, they're actually sister-in-laws.
Every area of the memorial honors each of the innocent people who were on board Flight 93 for 81 minutes.
The memorial is an incredible place, and I think when you visit, everyone has this idea of what they're going to see, and then they get here and they see this huge open meadow, and the emotion of September 11th comes all overwhelming back.
Providing hope and healing in the wake of the 9/11 attacks.
It's massive chaos when something like this happens.
How a local priest stepped in at a pivotal moment in our history.
On that day, when all hope seemed lost, there was still hope.
And how he helped the families of the passengers and crew of Flight 93 in the wake of the attacks.
Right now, another reflection on 9/11. Air Force fighter pilot Heather Penny was called into action that morning to track down a hijacked aircraft, a plane we all later learned was Flight 93. She says she was prepared to sacrifice her own life that day to prevent the hijacked aircraft from hitting its target on the ground. But she says the passengers and crew of Flight 93 acted first, not only saving the lives of people on the ground, but the lives of her and her wingman as well.
SAS and I were a mission failure because we didn't get there first. The passengers on Flight 93 not only saved our nation, but they spared us.
More reflections on that day that changed history are ahead as Chronicle Remembering 9/11 continues.
As people around the world saw the smoking crater left behind when this was just a field above an abandoned strip mine, they watched crews doing their diligent work.
One of those first responders had a dual mission when he arrived here at the crash site. A Pittsburgh priest trained as an FBI chaplain to serve agents. His mission shifted to care for the families of the 40 victims, providing hope and healing to people around the world.
In the hours after Flight 93 crashed, teams of first responders, many with years of experience, flooded the grassy field of the former strip mine.
It's massive chaos when something like this happens.
FBI chaplain Father Joe McCaffrey was among them.
I prayed and consecrated the ground where life was lost.
20 years later, he says he'll never forget meeting the grieving relatives of Flight 93's passengers and crew.
This is an enormous honor and privilege, and it was very humbling to be that person who was there, and to think of all these other folks who are here just giving their total selves to bring comfort and peace and really understand what's going on and what happened so that it doesn't happen again.
Sometimes, he said, it just meant holding their hand and lending an ear.
I think just being with them and making a connection with them, praying with them, listening to their stories, listening to the stories about their loved ones, just letting them tell the story, and letting them be angry, be upset, be frustrated, complain.
As agents on scene did their work, Father Mack did his, helping to plan the joint family prayer service, and he was on board the bus carrying families to the impact zone.
There are people lining the streets, saluting people. Or when you'd come to pass the state police barrier, they would salute the families. It was just amazing.
At the Heinz History Center, Father Mack's personal belongings are among the collection of Flight 93 artifacts, his FBI jacket and badge, as well as his mass kit and rosary beads. Father Joe, who is also a pilot, points to the faith of the passengers, their selfless courage trying to stop the hijackers from killing others in Washington, D.C.
I'd like to think that I would have been one of the people willing to take on the terrorists. But there's a part of me that says, I may have been paralyzed by fear. So you think, this grace of spirit and courage that these ordinary working folks had to say, no, we're not going to take this. We're going to try to do something. And when you hear the cockpit voice recorder, I had the impression that they almost did it.
In 2021, he wants people to think about the lessons learned in the days after 9/11, how to focus on others, recalling the simple mission of his chaplain work to provide hope and healing.
On that day, when all hope seemed lost, there was still hope, and there were still people of faith. And it's our faith in God, our faith in a just and loving, compassionate, merciful God, and life beyond the grave that sustains us.
As he leads the faithful in the Newcastle area, his ministry, his vocation, enriched by what he witnessed in that Somerset County field. He says, watching so many people opening their hearts to help, reminding us that faith is a dimension of our lives that is always present.
That is my hope, that we remember on that day, yes, a lot of terrible things happened, a lot of evil took place, but there was an even more overwhelming force of good.
Ahead on Chronicle.
We understood their actions and the heroic actions they took to stop further carnage.
Remembering 9/11 and the heroes of Flight 93.
I think it's one of the great acts of heroism.
The memories still alive 20 years after that fateful day.
Few of us will ever forget where we were, what we were doing on September 11, 2001.
And that includes many of our fellow journalists. Marcy Cipriani now with their memories of the day that changed the world.
It was pretty overwhelming. I was working in the newsroom that day, and I had heard that a plane had gone down near Shanksville.
We weren't sure where Shanksville was or where this crash site was. And
I jumped into the seat in our set that's in the newsroom and put on a mic.
For 20 years, those memories have never faded. In the seconds and minutes that followed 10:03 a.m. on September 11, 2001, journalists across Pennsylvania were joining those in New York City and Washington, D.C. United Flight 93 was down in rural Somerset County. It was the fourth airliner to crash in 77 minutes.
I'm reaching and I'm pulling my camera out and I'm thinking, this story is bigger than I'm capable of covering.
WTAE photojournalist Terry Connell and I were working together that day. He was 52 years old with decades of experience in news, But this day, things were different.
I can't tell you how many times I cried getting shots.
Connell and I found ourselves surrounded by cornfields, Somerset County farmers and their neighbors, and soon dozens of police and the FBI.
There was an order to evacuate downtown Pittsburgh.
Sally Wiggin was anchoring in the WTAE newsroom, 72 miles away. She just happened to stop at the station that morning and was quickly on set.
I just remember turning my head and looking at one of the monitors, and all of the roads were packed. It was like everybody all at once jumped in their car as if planes were going to start raining from the sky.
On set, Sally was calm, but she says she was horrified and afraid.
I think if I had had more information, it would have been more upsetting.
The images we were capturing on the ground were the first Sally and many others would see.
I thought to myself, that's where my dad grew up.
Tim Lambert was working for WITF in Harrisburg, 125 miles away, but he soon realized he was much closer.
After a very long day, like every other journalist in America, I returned home on September 12th about 1:30 in the morning, and I had an answering machine message from my dad. And when I hit play, my mouth dropped wide open because he said, "Those are our trees."
Lambert's family owned the land that would become the final resting spot of the 40 innocent passengers and crew aboard Flight 93.
According to State Police Captain Frank Monaco, they believe the plane was traveling southwest when he
This spot, marked 20 years ago by a large hole, burned hemlock trees, and mostly disintegrated pieces of the airliner that experts say hit the ground at more than 500 miles per hour. Connell and I stood here just hours after, taken by police aboard a bus with a few other journalists.
He did the stand up, and then we all got back on the bus and came back, and it was nobody, it wasn't a jovial mood or, oh wow, we're going to get to go to the crash site. It was like pretty somber on that bus.
Until all of you got out there, we were ad-libbing about something we couldn't see.
Wiggin spent most of the day and evening on set. Most of us covering the crash site didn't come home for days. I don't remember how many.
You like that, don't you?
Connell is the only one who did.
These animals depended on me. They didn't know anything about a plane crash. They didn't know anything about an attack on America.
Connell says the time with his horses gave him a bit of normalcy and peace from what happened just over the ridge from his home.
I would say about 18 miles from here, as you know, air miles. And in a southeast direction is Shanksville.
For Connell, now retired, covering 9/11 was an honor, one that is filled with images of tragedy and pain, including those of family members of those who died.
I was getting shots, and through the windows, you couldn't really identify people, but through the windows, somebody gave the V sign. It was pretty emotional seeing that.
For Wiggin, that day was about reassuring people who were relying on her for information.
You were hoping that you calmed them and made them think that they were going to be okay. Maybe the world wasn't going to be okay.
I'm a visitor here now.
And for Tim Lambert, his role as a journalist that day merged with that of a landowner and a commitment to making this spot where the passengers on Flight 93 fought in the air with their hijackers and ultimately died, a place where the families and the country can honor them.
We were part of the nation's history at that point, and that land really, on September 11th, stopped being ours as far as I was concerned.
September 11th, 2001 left images of horror forever imprinted in our memories.
And it also left us memories of heroism, from the 40 brave passengers and crew members on board Flight 93 to the heroic first responders who ran into the burning World Trade Center that morning.
Lessons learned from that day will stay with us for generations, an important reminder to never forget.
From all of us here at Chronicle, thank you for watching, and God bless America.